If you see either of these vehicles, you're probably already dead, and that is because these two vehicles in this video are showcasing some of the most powerful guns that these things have and how quickly they can take you out in World of Tanks. And of course we're focusing AMX-50 Foch B and the Jagdpanzer E100. So what do these two games offer? Well, they are some of the highest damage games that we've seen this patch, and it is showcasing the pure ability that both of these tanks have to remove enemies within this game. And because this vehicle especially has 2,400 alpha damage with its full clip, which means that yes, the 6-shot 400 alpha damage autoloader is very painful for your opponents, especially if you can manage to penetrate every single shell. Now the Foch B can also be fairly aggressive because it has the armor model to be able to do so, at least to some degree. Yes, you do have some pretty big horns that can be a pain in the backside, or at least the front side, but it's not all that bad, and so you can get away with it sometimes. And ultimately, because you've got 2,400 alpha, the opponents you'd have to be facing at this point would have to be able to hit you probably 5 times to do the same amount of damage back to you, so you never really have to worry all too much unless you're at the end of the game against 6 or 7 tanks all shooting you at the same time. But regardless of that, you saw there that the enemy WZ-114 decided to ram the Foch. Don't quite know why, but he gets taken out easily and without sacrificing any real hit points within this game. So what is this game showcasing in particular about the Foch B? Well, what the Foch B has over something like the Foch 155 is the consistency. There's nothing like having 2,400 alpha, really good accuracy. You're looking at 0.33 dispersion, which is really good considering this is a vehicle that has the 6-shot autoloader and has the potential to do so much damage. It also has a 2-second intra-clip reload, which means you're able to dish out the damage very quickly to your opponents without having to wait an absolute age, which some tanks can be very painful, and we all know the various different tanks in the game like that. For example, the enemy Foch 155, that has to wait almost 3.5 seconds, if not more, to be able to reload in between its clip. So it's not particularly great, and it can be very painful in scenarios where you're hoping to get all of your shells off, but then you only end up firing 1, and then you're sat there with 2 in the magazine, or alternatively you fire off 2 and then you're sat there with 1. It's all very annoying, especially if you are trying to be consistent and have these good games, whereas the Foch B, it doesn't really have that problem. Don't get me wrong, if you do fire 2 shells and you're left with 4 in the clip, it can be a little bit annoying, since the reload of this vehicle is 36 second space, which is painful to say the least, but it's not the worst thing in the world, and there's certainly worse things to see in this game. What you've also got is some frontal armour that can be kind of tricky to pen if you don't really know the weak points of the Foch, or if you're playing in a lower tier vehicle, and trust me, if you're playing a lower tier vehicle against the Foch, you're probably going to die from the front, and that's because this can basically take out every single tier 8 vehicle in the game from full health to 0, and it doesn't even need premium ammunition because of the 257mm that we're seeing in this, and of course 325 pen on the premium rounds, and we all know what rounds 90% of players use within World of Tanks. But in this game, what is the scenario going on? So we have the Foch 155, which can definitely take away the remaining hit points on Teddy here, but we also have the AMX-30B, the Sputnik, whatever you want to call it, the TVP that's really annoying, Hesh rounds or HEP rounds, and then we've got the AMX that's in the town, the AMX M454, which we did a video on the channel recently, so you can go back and have a look at that, which is just the kind of next step in Object 279E evolution, or at least since the update it's become comparable to the 279E to some degree. It's not nowhere near as good, to be honest, but it's definitely one of those that can surprise you. But one thing that I always love about the Foch B in particular is that you feel like you can carry, especially in the late game, because as we all know, autoloaders become even more dangerous as you get on, and this replay is going to showcase that. So you're seeing here that the Foch B does go into a fairly aggressive position behind this rock, trying to get some shots into the side of some of the enemy vehicles, but unfortunately does get spotted by the CS. However, the CS is well within the range of being taken out in the full clip, and considering there is a full 6-shot clip in the tank right now, it definitely wasn't the best idea to take on this Foch. So what we're going to see here is just annihilation, not only because the Foch has the clip potential to take this tank out, but it also is not the slowest vehicle that you've seen in World of Tanks, and that is because this thing can go 50 kilometers an hour base, and obviously dependent on your perk setup and equipment setup and everything else, you can make this go even faster. Obviously if you're using turbo or something like that, you can potentially go even faster, and some of the field modifications potentially, but you don't need that when you're in this vehicle, because what you can do is you can get yourself into a nice position in the time that you're kind of waiting to fully reload. Now what you're seeing here is a perfectly aimed shot into the enemy tank here, and then the Sptuk comes out of nowhere. He does get set on fire with the second shell that hits him and leaves him only on 48 hit points, which is lovely to see, since that is definitely a one shot no matter what round you're firing, so that's always good. So having done 4,000 damage, you've got to be sweating your balls off at this point, because if you want to win, you've got to come out on top against 4 enemy tanks, and there's 4,000 damage left in this replay to take hold of, and it's definitely doable, but you have to get a little bit lucky with some of the bounces and just hope that multiple tanks don't come and attack you at the same time that you're reloading, as you're seeing here with the reload taking such a long time. Now the CS-59 doesn't seem to appear to know the weak point of the Foch, which is of course getting around the side, but unfortunately for the CS, the Foch is now fully reloaded and with a lovely round into the track of the Foch, finishing off the Sptuk and then turning around and finishing off the CS-59. This is what you want. This is what the Foch B is all about, taking on multiple tanks at the same time and winning, not just like some of the other vehicles that can take on multiple tanks but end up getting sausage sandwiched and ended up back in the garage. The Foch B can come out on top, and now we're seeing the classic case of a 1 versus 2 situation at the end of the game against 2 vehicles that could very easily take out this tank in the Foch 155 and the CC1 Mark II. So these are 2 tanks that are well within capability to take out the Foch, especially considering he's only on 900 hit points and they're on at least 1,100 each, dependent on the share of the hit points on the enemy team. Now, one of them is definitely in the cap, the other is probably being pretty aggressive, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Foch 155 is the vehicle coming to attack, and as we say that, he does appear around the corner. Now this is where the Foch, where you have to get a little bit lucky. Oh wait, no you don't, because the Foch B has the superb interclip reload comparatively to the Foch 155, and that is exactly why the Foch B is more powerful than the Foch 155 in my opinion. Yes, it does have more alpha in the Foch 155 because you get the 155mm, but it doesn't have that pack a punch in terms of consistency to deal with that damage all the way through, and so with the intricate reload on the Foch 155 it's not nice at all. But regardless of that, it's time to focus on the CC1 Mark II, who sat inside of the cap and he's definitely wanting to be dug out. Now the CC does get spotted, and luckily he doesn't get spotted in return, and unfortunately for the CC, with the poor view range that he does obviously have, it's not good, and luckily the CC bounces off of him and he secures the victory within this game of World of Tanks. And what a decent replay that we had right there, showcasing the kind of things that the Foch B can do. The next replay we have focuses on the big bad and the ugly Jagdpanzer E100, and this is going to be a superb replay, focusing all on how the E100 can just punish opponents and how it can come out on top. Now, talking about coming out on top, the Object 268 on the enemy team gets spotted by the house, and of course already 1000 damage has been done, and that is all the jageroo is about. It is about dealing the high alpha damage, about just being a monstrosity to the enemy team, just being a bloody nuisance. There's just so many opportunities where you can come out with high damage results because the enemies just line up one by one and you can come out with the damage, and that is exactly how the jageroo is designed to play. That's exactly how the jageroo is. Does it guarantee that you're going to be able to deal the damage that maybe you'd hope for in the jageroo every single game? Absolutely not, but it definitely can guarantee you 1800 damage within the first minute of the game, and yes, it is a very, very satisfying result when you're just derping people for 1000 damage every single time. And by derp I just mean in terms of the damage, because this thing does not need the derp with 299mm of penetration on its standard rounds, and of course the jageroo 420 heat on its premium rounds. So yes, this vehicle is more than capable of dealing with any tank in the game, regardless of the armor model, whether it's an IS-7 or whether it's a Char Futur. It doesn't matter what it is, it's going to be taking 1000 damage, and so that's exactly what you want from your high tier tank destroyers. Now, am I saying this vehicle is OP? Absolutely not. The vehicle is not overpowered, but if this is sat there watching you and you poke out from a corner, you better know that if you're on less than 1000 hit points, you're getting taken out. The jageroo definitely doesn't need flashy gameplay, because what it's all about, as we've already mentioned, is just pumping and churning out thousands upon thousands of damage upon unsuspecting victims like the T110E5 or potentially this 121B who's trying to cross on the opposite side. And because the bushes are your friend on World of Tanks, you can kind of prepare for them, and the 121B is going to cross around this river area, and hopefully he crosses where you see in the open area, and then we can get another shell of damage on him, and unfortunately for him, he does just that. And 878 damage with a pretty nasty low roll, to be honest, means that he's dealt nearly 5000 damage in just 5 shells on the game, which is crazy to think that such a vehicle has been in the game for so long and actually isn't that OP, considering that you can have games like this. It's just all about position. It's all about just waiting for your opponents to come around and being able to deal and focus on the targets that you think are going to be the most painful for you to deal with, and that's kind of where the skill of the jageroo comes into play. So there's one blaring weak point, of course, about the vehicle, and you can already see it here with this vehicle having a giant hole in the lower plate, and that is the key weak point of it. You also then have the cupola, and if you're coming up against other jageroos, the superstructure can be a weak point, but like 95% of tanks just sheerly don't have the penetration to do that, so it's not really a weak point. And considering most tanks in the game, if a jageroo's firing heat at you, are going to pen regardless of where they're hitting, then I wouldn't really call it a weak point. It's just a feature of the game at that point. But you can see here the enemy Maus, one of the juicy targets on the enemy team that you just want to see, is potentially going to come around this corner and make the same mistake that the 121B has. And considering that the jageroo has barely moved out of the spawn and he's managed to pick up 6,500 damage, you wouldn't necessarily want to move anymore. Now, granted, the enemy team have not really made any effort to try and counter him all too much, other than the tanks that have actually come across, but we all know what happened to them. So you can see the Maus is starting to make the 121B mistake, and he does make that mistake, taking a 1,100 damage hit, which is lovely. It means that it's broken now 7,500 damage within this game, and no matter what happens now, you've had a great game if you've managed to deal that much damage. And considering you've just got heat rounds left, why not just fire them? And against a Maus that generally relies upon the thickness of the armour, compared to the actual slope of the armour and all of the angling that the armour provides, it's very easy once you have the penetration that's just higher than the armour thickness to basically go through them every single time. Now the 60 TP on the enemy team is of course sat out where his friend the T124 had died before, but nonetheless he gets taken out pretty quickly by a teammate after the fire actually missed in that shot. So you might be thinking, well, the jageroo, it's gonna have terrible dispersion, it's not gonna be able to hit things reliably, and that would actually be false. This vehicle has 0.34 dispersion, which is actually really good for a tier 10 tank destroyer, especially with the alpha that this does carry. And granted, you don't get a turret, so that probably affects a little bit of it, but it's still an amazing kind of dispersion value, and that allows you to be able to have so many consecutive great shells that you're seeing here into vehicles that maybe you wouldn't have thought you'd be able to hit with a lot of the other vehicles. Things like the FE 4005, you'd only dream of hitting things across the map with any real reliability, unless of course you can deal with the shell delay, and of course the best players can still make these vehicles work, but the jageroo is probably a more new player friendly tank comparatively to something like the FE 4005 or the FE 215B183. Now the Manticore, thinking he's funny, decides to try and attack the jageroo, and unfortunately for him he takes a lovely 1070 damage hit, taking probably 3/4 of his vehicle with him, and that is exactly what the jageroo is all about. It's about just putting your middle finger up to your opponents and saying, no, 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 no. You cannot just YOLO me, you can't just come at me. And granted, sometimes they can just YOLO you and get round the side of you, but in these sorts of games where you've got team support, it can be very difficult for them to do that, and if they do, they're going to be taking 1000 damage in return. So this is the painful part about the jageroo, and that is when you do decide to try and move forward, because it's a lumbering oaf. There's no other word for it. It's painfully slow. You are going to be taking time to get towards the opponents that you want to come up against, and so yeah, you've got to wait, you've got to be prepared to stumble across the valley, you've got to stumble your way across the map and potentially come up against vehicles that are going to have way better view range than you, that are going to spot you, they're going to out-traverse you and deal with you in that way. So although this is a brilliant tank when sat in a defensive position where the enemies just have to push towards you, it can be very difficult in an aggressive position to make it work 100% of the time, because of the fact that it's so inflexible when it comes to moving and being kind of able to reposition. So that's kind of where the jageroo's downfalls are, and of course it's important to showcase the downfalls, because you can always remember these amazing games where you're able to push out nearly 10,000 damage, if not more. But sometimes it's not always the case, and there are weak points of vehicles like this. But granted, the FE 4005 on the enemy team gets taken out at the end of the battle, and yes, what a replay from the jageroo. Yeah, fantastic. Both the Foch and the jageroo are brilliant tanks. But why don't you check out what the Object 268 version 4, the Bobject, can do in World of Tanks, and that is what is on screen right now. So you can click on that video, see what that vehicle is all about, and hopefully you did enjoy. Subscribe if you're not already, because there are tons of you that aren't subscribed at this point, and I hope that you join me on the journey of growing this YouTube channel. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.